In cold blood, the dark truth you can't escape. Hook. Ever felt like you're trapped in a never-ending nightmare, with no escape? What if everything you believed was real turned out to be a twisted reflection of something far darker? Join us as we dive deep into a mind-bending journey, where reality, fear, and fate collide in ways you won't see coming. You'll want to stay till the end, because the shocking twist will leave you questioning everything. Don't blink, or you might miss it. The wind howled outside, scratching at the window. Inside, the air was thick, stale, almost suffocating. The faint hum of an old fan. It did nothing to break the silence. But something else. Something just beyond the edge of hearing. A soft shuffle. Barely noticeable, but there. A quick glance to the door. Still closed. The house was empty. Too empty. The floorboards groaned underfoot. Each step felt like it echoed. Too loud. Too sharp. She stood still. Listening. Nothing but the creak of wood, the murmur of the wind. But then, a faint tap. On the window. A single, quiet tap. Her heart jumped. She froze. The sound repeated. Another tap. Closer. Her fingers trembled on the edge of the chair. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. The tapping grew louder. Persistent. Each tap like a hammer. Faster now. Quick, desperate. She could feel the room shrink. The shadows growing darker. The temperature dropping. A figure appeared in the corner of her vision. Only for a second. Then gone. Her pulse quickened. Her throat tightened. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, there was no sound at all. Complete silence. Too silent. She exhaled slowly, cautiously. Then, from the corner of the room, a whisper. Barely a breath. But it was enough. It chilled her to the core. The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't even human. The words blurred, unintelligible. But the tone. The tone was unmistakable. It was calling her. Her name. And it was coming closer. The whisper grew louder. Closer. A chill crawled up her spine. Her legs felt weak. She wanted to move, to run, but couldn't. Her feet were cemented to the floor. Her hands clutched the chair, knuckles white. The air thickened, stifling. Each breath a struggle. The voice was almost at her ear now. She could feel the heat of it. The breath, cold and damp. Her skin prickled. She wanted to scream, but her throat wouldn't cooperate. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. Her name again. And then, a soft thud. Like something heavy being set down. Behind her. Without thinking, she turned. The room was empty. But the shadows. They shifted. Moved. Twisted. Her eyes darted around, frantic. The window, now wide open. How? She had locked it. Hadn't she? A figure stood in the doorway. Tall, almost unnatural. Dark eyes locked onto hers. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The figure stepped forward. Slow, deliberate. The shadows clung to it like a second skin. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A glint of something shiny in the figure's hand. A knife. Her stomach dropped. Instinct kicked in. She bolted. Her feet pounded the floor, but her body felt heavy. The figure was right behind her. Faster now. Closer. She could hear its breath. Hot. Ragged. The door. Just ahead. A few more steps. Her fingers brushed the handle. But it didn't turn. Locked. Her heart raced. Her vision blurred. The figure reached out. A cold hand. Closing in. She screamed. But the sound was lost in the void. She stood there, frozen, eyes wide. The silence seemed endless. Her breath shaky, erratic. The door creaked, swinging back and forth in the breeze. Everything felt out of place. Her pulse still pounded in her ears. She glanced around the room. Nothing. No sign of the figure. No trace of the cold presence. But the shadows. They were deeper now. More twisted. Her hands shook as she stepped forward. Slowly. Tentatively. Each footstep felt like an eternity. Her gaze never left the doorway. She reached for the handle again. This time it turned. The door opened. She stepped out into the hallway. The floor beneath her feet groaned with every movement. She didn't want to go further. But something drew her forward. A pull, almost magnetic. The hallway stretched ahead, endless, dark. She hesitated. The air was thick with something she couldn't explain. A pressure. The walls seemed to close in. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. A soft sound, almost inaudible, reached her ears. A shuffle. It came from the end of the hall. Her heart stopped. A figure, shaped in the dark. Barely visible. She wanted to scream. But the sound caught in her throat. The figure moved closer. Step by slow step. The tension built. Every breath she took felt like it might be her last. The figure was almost within arm's reach. Her body trembled, frozen in place. But then, the light flickered. The figure disappeared. Just like before. Gone. Her mind raced. What was happening? What was watching her? She wanted to turn back. To run. But something made her stay. The darkness at the end of the hall beckoned. She couldn't look away. Her feet moved before she could stop them. Each step felt heavier, like the darkness was pulling her in. Her breath was shallow, labored. The silence around her was suffocating. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching for anything, but there was nothing. Just the thick, oppressive blackness. She reached the end of the hallway. A door loomed in front of her, cracked open just enough to see into the room beyond. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The cool metal of the doorknob sent a jolt through her. She twisted it slowly. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was dimly lit. A faint glow, coming from nowhere. It illuminated a large, old mirror on the far wall. But the reflection. It wasn't hers. The figure in the mirror stood still, its back to her. The figure from before. The one with the knife. She gasped, stumbling back. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The reflection in the mirror shifted, turning slowly. Its eyes met hers. A cold, vacant stare. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure's lips parted, but no sound came. The room grew colder. Her entire body trembled, and yet she couldn't look away. The reflection raised its hand. The same knife from before, gleaming in the dim light. Her pulse quickened. It took a step toward her, though she was still standing in the hallway. And then, the reflection's mouth moved. It wasn't words, but a sound. A soft hum. It was as if it was calling her. Her eyes locked on the mirror, hypnotized by the motion. And then, with a sickening twist, the reflection stepped out of the mirror. Its feet hit the floor with a low thud. Reality shifted. The figure was right in front of her. And the knife, raised high, was aimed directly at her heart. The room felt colder now, emptier. The shadows were deeper, more oppressive. Her breath fogged in the air, though the heat was still off. She looked around, expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the corners. But there was nothing. No more figures. No more whispers. Just the silence. That crushing, all-encompassing silence. She staggered to her feet, knees weak. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. The floor beneath her was slick, damp with her sweat. She wiped her face, trying to clear the fog from her mind. What had just happened? Her hand brushed her side. The coolness of metal against her skin. The knife. It was in her hand now, as if she'd taken it without realizing. The blade gleamed under the dim light, the same as before. She dropped it, her hand shaking. It hit the floor with a dull thud. For a long moment she stood there, unmoving. Just breathing. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this house. The front door. That was the only way out. She turned toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her pulse was still racing, but now there was something else. A creeping suspicion. She looked behind her, but the hallway was empty. The house felt wrong. Like it was waiting. Her breath came faster, anxiety building in her chest. She reached the door. Tried to turn the handle. It wouldn't budge. She twisted it again. Still nothing. Her heart began to pound again. Frantic. She pulled at the door with all her strength, but it wouldn't open. The house seemed to grow darker. The air thicker. The walls closing in. Her panic surged. The whisper returned. Barely audible, like a breeze, but it was there. Her name. She whipped around, searching the shadows. But the voice came from everywhere. It was in her head. In her blood. A soft, mocking chuckle echoed through the room. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound real. And yet, it was unmistakable. The walls seemed to pulse, alive. The door groaned. Shuddered. And then, it swung open. Not by her hand. But by something else. Something far darker. The door creaked wide, slowly, as if it was alive. The air shifted, heavy with dread. A dark figure stood in the doorway, backlit by an unseen light. Its outline was blurry, shifting with the shadows. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs were frozen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. A suffocating silence followed. The whispers faded, but the tension remained. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped backward. Closer and closer to the dark shape. The air thickened. The figure's form solidified. Its features were still hidden, but she could feel its presence, pressing in. The coldness. The weight. She reached out for the wall to steady herself, but it felt wrong. Like the walls themselves were closing in. Her fingers brushed the surface. And the world seemed to tilt. The air felt thick, as though she were submerged in water. Her eyes locked onto the figure, now only a few feet away. Its face was still obscured, but she could feel it. It was watching her. Waiting. And then, the figure's mouth opened. A low, guttural growl rumbled from within. The sound was so deep, it vibrated in her bones. Her heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows seemed to ripple around the figure, drawing it closer. It didn't walk. It floated. Slowly. The ground beneath her seemed to shake. The walls trembled. The ceiling cracked with a deafening snap. A sharp, white light flared from the figure's eyes. It reached out. And everything went black. A chill so cold it felt like ice spread through her veins. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The darkness swallowed her whole. And for a moment, there was nothing. Nothing but the pulse of the shadows. The silence was unbearable. She couldn't tell where she was. Or if she was even still breathing. Her body felt heavy. Numb. Her mind, trapped in the void, struggled to grasp reality. Then, a faint whisper. A voice, distant but familiar. Her name. Her eyes snapped open. She was lying on the floor. The room around her was different. Smaller. Dimmer. A damp, earthy smell filled the air. She blinked, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Her hand shot out to steady herself, but the ground was cold, uneven. Gravel? Dirt? Her pulse quickened as she tried to sit up. The walls around her were jagged, crumbling. And then, through the haze, she saw it. A door. Wooden, old, with strange symbols carved into the surface. It was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered beyond. Her breath hitched. She had to get out. But as she stood, her legs barely supporting her, the whispers returned. Closer now. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking her. She had to get to the door. She pushed herself forward, each step slow, calculated. Her heart raced. Her skin crawled. The door. She was so close. But the whispers grew louder. More urgent. The light on the other side flickered, as if something was moving behind it. She reached out, her hand trembling. The moment her fingers brushed the wood, the whispers stopped. The room grew cold again. Her breath visible in the air. She hesitated. There was no turning back. She pushed the door open. The moment it moved, the ground beneath her shook. The light exploded into a blinding flash. And then, darkness again. Total, suffocating blackness. She stumbled, her vision spinning. The ground beneath her buckled, and she fell. Fingers scraped the stone floor, cold and sharp. Something moved in the dark. The familiar, chilling presence. She wasn't alone. She scrambled to her feet, her body shaking. The air was thick, impossible to breathe. The sound of someone breathing. Slow. Steady. Too close. Her eyes darted around, but there was nothing to see. Just darkness. And the presence. It was everywhere. It whispered her name, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Her breath hitched in her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The coldness wrapped around her like a blanket. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. The darkness seemed to pulse, like it was alive. She reached out blindly, her hand grazing something soft. Cloth. A person? Her fingers brushed against it, but it didn't feel human. It felt wrong. Her body tensed. She pulled her hand back quickly. Then, a light, faint but unmistakable. A single flicker, far off in the distance. It illuminated nothing but shadows. But the shape. The shape was there again. The figure. Looming in the periphery, just out of clear view. Her heartbeat echoed in her skull. She had to move. She had to run. Her legs felt like stone, heavy, unwilling. The figure moved closer. Slow. Gliding. Its form flickered in and out of sight, like a bad memory. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, desperate to escape. But then, a voice. Not the whispers. A clear, cold voice. "I've been waiting for you." The words were sharp. Serrated. They cut through the silence like a blade. She froze, unable to comprehend. It wasn't just any voice. It was familiar. But she couldn't place it. Her mind screamed. She had to run, but the darkness was everywhere now. It was closing in. Trapping her. Her breath came faster. The light flickered again. And in the brief moment it illuminated her surroundings, she saw it. The figure's face. And she realized. It was her own reflection. Her blood ran cold. The face staring back at her wasn't just a mirror image. It was twisted. Distorted. The eyes were hollow, sunken deep into the face, black as voids. The skin was pale, sickly, stretching too tight across the bones. Her mouth, twisted into a grin that wasn't hers. A grin that didn't belong. Her own reflection. But not her. The figure stepped closer, moving with unnatural grace, almost floating. Her body froze. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The reflection's grin widened, stretching, cracking in ways that shouldn't be possible. A voice, soft but chilling, whispered through the darkness. "You've always been here, haven't you?" The words sank into her like daggers. A deep, suffocating pressure filled her chest. Her own reflection reached out. And the moment its fingers brushed her face, the world around her shattered. It was like glass breaking. Everything splintered. The ground beneath her cracked open. Darkness swallowed her whole. Her stomach dropped. She fell, faster, farther. The cold air hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't see. Couldn't feel. The falling, endless. And then, just as suddenly, she stopped. The world went silent. For a moment, she thought she was dead. But the darkness was still there. Thick, suffocating. Her body ached. She couldn't move. A low, distant hum filled the air. A sound so deep, it vibrated her very bones. It was familiar, like a heartbeat. Her heartbeat. But it wasn't just hers. It was everywhere. The very walls. The floor beneath her. The hum seemed to pulse through the air, rising and falling, in time with the darkness. She opened her eyes, but there was no light. No shapes. Only blackness, deeper than she thought possible. Her body trembled, but she didn't know why. She didn't know if she could ever escape. And then, a whisper again. Closer now. I told you, you've always been here. The voice was unmistakable. Her voice. But not anymore. The whisper crawled into her mind like ice, spreading through her thoughts. I've always been here. It repeated, the words pulling at something deep inside her. She tried to move, but her limbs were heavy, as if the darkness itself was holding her down. Her body refused to obey. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and panicked. She needed to get out. She needed to wake up. But the darkness pressed in tighter. The hum was louder now. A pulsating rhythm, like the very air around her was alive. Alive, just like the reflection. Her reflection. That twisted, smiling face? Was that really her? Was it? The voice came again, soft, so soft. It's always been you. You've always known. A sudden pull in her chest. A sharp tug, like her very soul was being yanked somewhere. Her heart pounded, faster now, as though it was fighting against the force trying to drag her down. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The air was thick, heavy in her lungs. She could feel something moving in the dark. Not the reflection. No. Something else. Something far older. Something that had been waiting, watching. Her eyes darted frantically through the blackness, but it was endless. Nothing but the suffocating void. Her chest tightened. Her pulse echoed in her ears. And then, a cold hand gripped her wrist. She gasped, her breath caught in her throat. The touch was like ice, freezing her to the core. Slowly she turned her head. The outline of a figure appeared before her, the edges shifting in the dark. A face emerged too close. Her own face. But wrong. The eyes gleamed black, filled with emptiness. The smile spread wider, too wide, stretching unnaturally. It wasn't a mirror anymore. It was something else. Something that had taken her place. You can't run anymore. It whispered, its voice mocking, cruel. Her body trembled uncontrollably. And before she could react, the figure drew her closer, its grip tightening. The world around her began to fold, collapse. Like the fabric of reality was unraveling. She tried to scream again, but the darkness swallowed it whole. The last thing she heard was her own laughter. Faint at first, but growing louder. The laughter echoed, hollow and twisted, filling the void. It wasn't hers, but it was. A distorted, mocking version of herself. It vibrated through her skull, rattling her bones. She tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was iron. Unyielding. Her body moved against her will, dragged into the depths of the darkness. The light she had seen before, flickering, distant, was now gone. All that remained was the crushing weight of the void. And the laughter. Closer now. More familiar. The edges of her vision blurred. Her own face stared back at her, but it was contorting, shifting with each passing moment. Its eyes, those black, hollow pits, never left hers. I told you, you were always meant for this. The words slid into her mind, slipping past her defenses. There was no escape. No hope. Her body refused to move. Her limbs frozen, as though bound by invisible chains. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her, devouring her. And then, for just a brief moment, a crack. A light, thin and fragile, broke through the black. A door. A way out. She wanted to run toward it, but something held her back. A force, heavier than anything she had ever felt. The figure pulled her closer, its face inches from hers now. Its smile stretched impossibly wide. The laughter was unbearable. A sound like broken glass, like something shattering inside her. And then, the door slammed shut. The light was gone. The laughter grew louder, the figure's grip tightening with every passing second. Her chest felt like it was caving in. The darkness swallowed her whole. And in the end, there was only silence. The silence was suffocating. The kind of silence that presses in on your mind, bends your thoughts. For a long while, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the cold emptiness. She couldn't feel her body anymore. No weight. No pain. Just nothing. And then, a flicker. A tiny spark of light in the distance. At first, it was so faint, she wondered if it was real. But it pulsed, grew stronger, drawing her in. She reached out, though her hands felt like they weren't hers. The light grew brighter, illuminating the space around her. Shadows shifted, twisting. She could hear a faint hum now. Like the world was waking up. A low whisper in the air. "You've returned." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar. But it wasn't hers. It wasn't the figure's either. It was something older. Something ancient. Her eyes searched the growing light. And then she saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the light. Its outline was blurred, but its presence was unmistakable. She felt it deep in her chest. It was watching her. Waiting. The air around her thickened. Her body was shaking again. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the light. It was taller than any human, its form ethereal, shifting. Its face was hidden, but she could feel its gaze. Piercing. Cold. "You've always been part of this," the voice said again, clearer now. "Always part of the dark." Her pulse quickened. It was like a whisper from the deepest part of her soul. The light flickered one last time, revealing the figure's hand. A long, skeletal hand, reaching toward her. Its fingers stretched, unnaturally long. It wasn't offering anything. It was pulling. Drawing her closer to the darkness again. The hum grew louder, vibrating her bones. Her mind screamed for release. But there was no escape. Not this time. Her feet moved, almost against her will, toward the figure. And the moment her hand touched its cold, skeletal fingers, everything went dark again. The darkness was all-consuming. There was no light now, no flickers, no whispers. Just a thick, suffocating void. Her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. Her body felt trapped, suspended in a place with no time, no space. A coldness seeped into her very bones, deep into her soul. It was as if she was fading, melting into the emptiness around her. The only sound was her own breath, ragged and strained. She couldn't move. She couldn't see. But she could feel. Something was still there. Watching. Waiting. Her pulse was erratic now, fear and confusion mixing together, twisting her insides. A sudden jolt. A sharp pain in her chest. Her heart skipped a beat. She gasped, trying to inhale, but the air felt thick, heavy. And then, a sharp, searing light. It wasn't gentle. It was blinding, cutting through the darkness like a blade. She winced, her eyes snapping open in reflex. For a moment, the light was too much to bear. But as it dimmed, she could see. She was standing again. But everything was wrong. The place around her wasn't familiar. The walls were made of stone, cold and jagged. A place she knew, but couldn't remember. She was trapped. Again. The same thick air clung to her skin, suffocating. The light flickered once more. The figure was there. It had returned. Not in the distance this time, but standing right before her. Its form was clearer now. Its face, a reflection of her own. But twisted. Distorted. A grotesque mockery. Her eyes locked onto its black, hollow gaze. It grinned. That same sickening grin. And for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was looking at herself or something else entirely. The voice came again, but this time it was stronger. "You can never escape," it said, its words cutting through her mind like shards of glass. The figure reached out, its long, cold fingers brushing her skin. A shiver ran through her entire being. "You are a part of this. Always have been." Her breath caught in her throat. Her knees buckled. The room seemed to close in, the walls narrowing. The air grew thinner, the space tighter. She was suffocating again. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. And then, a deep, bone-chilling laugh filled the room. Her own laugh. Louder. Uncontrollable. It wasn't her anymore. It couldn't be. And yet she knew it was. The laugh reverberated through the cold, stone walls. It shook her, rattling her mind, echoing in every corner of the room. A laugh that wasn't hers, but felt like it was. A dark, twisted version of herself. Her legs gave way completely, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The walls pressed in tighter, as if the very room were alive, suffocating her with its weight. The light flickered again, flickering and dimming, then cutting out entirely. And for a moment, all was still. Dark. Complete silence. But she could still feel it. The presence. The weight of the figure's gaze burning into her. She couldn't move. Her heart was a wild drumbeat in her chest. And then, the air shifted. A cold breeze, sharp and biting, blew through the room. The stone walls groaned, shifting, groaning like they were alive. The figure was standing over her now, closer than ever. Its grin, that same wicked, twisted smile, stretched impossibly wide. "You think you can escape?" the figure whispered, its voice low, mocking. "You're part of this. Always have been." Her hands trembled as she reached for the floor, but it felt like her fingers were sinking into it, as though the very ground was pulling her down. She struggled, trying to stand, to move, but her body was sluggish, as if she were drowning in the air itself. The figure didn't move. It simply watched. Its eyes, black as midnight, were pits of emptiness. And then, the figure raised a hand. Not a hand, but something darker, longer, like claws that gleamed in the dim light. It hovered above her, motionless, waiting. Her breath caught in her throat. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The claws reached toward her. And as they made contact, her body flared with a jolt of cold. Ice. The chill spread from her chest, gripping her heart, suffocating it. The air rushed out of her lungs. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The claws dug deeper, pressing into her skin, pulling at something inside her. Her vision blurred, the edges darkening. She could feel herself slipping, falling, into the darkness again. But this time, she didn't fight. She couldn't. She felt the pull of the void, like it was calling to her, inviting her to join it forever. And in the deepest part of her mind she knew there was no escape. The void stretched out before her, vast and endless. It consumed everything, the air, her thoughts, her very essence. The figure loomed above her, its form growing larger, casting a shadow that swallowed the last of the dim light. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The claws that had pierced her skin began to tighten, pulling her deeper, as if they were tearing through her very soul. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body was frozen. The pain was unbearable. The figure's voice, hollow and distant, filled her head. "You've always been mine," it whispered, the words wrapping around her like chains. "You belong here. You always have." She tried to focus, to fight back, but the darkness only grew stronger. The laughter, her own laughter, echoed through the blackness, a cruel reminder that she was trapped, bound to this place. The figure leaned closer, its face now inches from hers. Its grin twisted, more grotesque than before, as though it was consuming her very identity. A cold, sharp breath brushed her skin. "You will never leave," it said, each word sinking deep into her bones. The air around her thickened, pressing down on her chest. She couldn't escape. Not from this place. Not from this thing that had claimed her. The claws that had been digging into her skin suddenly withdrew, and she collapsed, gasping for breath, her lungs burning with the need for air. But there was no air. Only the oppressive weight of the dark. She tried to stand, but her body was numb, her legs refusing to obey. And then she saw it. In the corner of her vision, a faint flicker of light. A door. A way out? She had to reach it. With trembling hands, she pushed herself onto her knees, crawling toward the light. Each movement was sluggish, as if the darkness was pulling her back, dragging her under. But she fought. Fought for that sliver of hope. She crawled toward the door. Closer. Closer. The figure was still there, but it didn't move. It watched her, silent and patient. Closer. She reached out, her fingers brushing the door's edge. The moment she touched it, a shock ran through her, as if the door itself had a life of its own. The figure's voice rose in a chilling, mocking laughter. No matter how far you run, you cannot escape. And in that instant, the door slammed shut. The light blinked out. The laughter grew louder. And the darkness pressed in, swallowing every trace of light. Her body felt heavy, as though gravity itself had turned against her. The door was gone. The light vanished. The laughter still echoed, but it wasn't just from the figure anymore. It was everywhere. Filling her mind. Filling the very air around her. The coldness crept deeper, pulling her into an abyss where time no longer existed. She tried to scream again, but her voice was swallowed before it even reached her throat. She clawed at the air, reaching for anything to ground her, but there was nothing. Just the crushing emptiness. The figure stood at the edge of her perception, a dark shape in the sea of black. Its presence loomed, suffocating, unrelenting. You can't escape, it whispered, its voice a soft, sickening hiss. She could feel its eyes on her, though she couldn't see its face. But she could feel it. Always watching. She wanted to run, wanted to break free, but she couldn't. Her limbs were as if encased in concrete. Her mind screamed in panic, but it was muffled by the unending void. Then a shift. A movement. Not the figure this time. The darkness itself twisted, as if it were alive, reacting to her fear. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the air, long fissures opening wide, leaking a faint, sickly light. Her heart raced. The cracks widened, and the faint light bled through, casting an eerie glow on her surroundings. Was this an escape? The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. But this time, it didn't speak. It didn't move. It just watched. She could feel it pulling her toward the fissures. Her body began to move on its own, dragged by some unseen force, as if the cracks in the darkness were magnets. She fought, clawing at the air, but the pull was too strong. Closer. Closer. Her feet lifted off the ground, and she was dragged through the cracks, her body twisting unnaturally, against her will. The air grew colder still. The light flickered, and for a brief moment she saw it. A face. Her own face. Twisted in a permanent scream. The cracks swallowed her whole, and then nothing. Complete, suffocating blackness. The blackness around her was complete. Not even the faintest glimmer of light remained. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her heartbeat thudded painfully in her chest, each pulse louder than the last. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, but there was no relief. Nothing but the crushing emptiness. She reached out, but her hands meant nothing. Her fingers grazed the air, trembling, as if searching for something, anything, to hold on to. A chill wrapped around her, curling into her bones. A voice, soft and almost drowned in the silence, whispered in her ear. Always you? Her heart lurched. The words felt like a weight. A truth she didn't want to face. She was trapped. There was no escape. But then, the darkness began to shift. Not like before. This was different. It moved like it was breathing, alive, curling and twisting around her, taking form. Shapes emerged, faint at first, then clearer. Familiar shapes. Shadows stretched, warping into grotesque versions of her own memories. Faces, places, moments long forgotten. They hovered in the dark, watching her. Judging her. Her pulse quickened, panic rising in her chest. The shadows closed in, surrounding her, pressing in from every angle. But there, in the center, was one thing that didn't belong. A door. A door that hadn't been there before. It stood alone, framed by the swirling shadows. The edges gleamed faintly, as if the door was made of light, shining through the blackness. She couldn't understand it. Couldn't resist it. Her feet moved toward it, one step at a time, despite the overwhelming fear. The closer she got, the more the shadows recoiled, as though they were afraid of it. She reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed the cool surface of the door. And in that instant, everything stopped. The air cleared, and the oppressive weight vanished. The door swung open. Beyond it, she saw something she hadn't expected. Light. A vast, endless sky. Freedom. The dark, suffocating weight lifted entirely as she stepped through. And with it, the whispers stopped. The presence was gone. She was free. The door closed quietly behind her. A soft click that seemed to echo in the stillness. She stood in the light now, fully bathed in it, as if the darkness had never existed. The world around her felt solid, real, tangible. She blinked against the brightness, trying to adjust. It was a place unlike any she had ever known, vast, open, and untouched. The air was warm, soft against her skin, and every breath felt like it was filling a void she hadn't known existed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. The ground beneath her feet was smooth, a rich earth that seemed to hum with energy, and all around, the light danced like 1,000 stars. She looked up. The sky stretched on forever, clear and boundless, a deep blue that promised peace, a stark contrast to the suffocating black she had just escaped. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, absorbing the silence and serenity, but it felt like a lifetime, a weight lifting off her shoulders with each passing moment. No laughter. No shadows. Just pure, unfiltered quiet. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like she was being watched. She felt free. But then, a soft whisper tugged at her thoughts, a faint murmur that seemed to come from within her own mind. It was barely a breath. "Are you sure?" The words lingered, but there was no darkness to them, no malice. Just a question. She stood still, pondering it. Her gaze shifted to the horizon. The light seemed to shift ever so slightly, almost as if it was inviting her forward, towards something new, something beyond this moment. But she didn't move. She didn't need to. The decision was hers, and for the first time, it felt like she could make it on her own terms. No shadows. No figures looming in the distance. Just her. The sky. And the open road ahead. She smiled, a small, soft curve of her lips. For the first time in a long time, it felt like everything was finally right. And with that, she took her first step forward, leaving the past behind. And walking into the light.